The morning light filtered through the massive crystal dome of the Galactic Academy as students from dozens of worlds hurried across the courtyard. Alex Thompson clutched his worn laptop bag tighter as he watched beings that defied imagination walk past him with casual grace. A group of tall blue Ashanti floated by on crystalline wings, their bodies shimmering like living gemstones. Behind them, the insect-like Drachmori clicked their way across the polished floor, their multiple arms carrying devices that hummed with unknown energy. Alex felt his palms grow sweaty as he approached the grand amphitheater where the annual Xenobiology Symposium would take place. This was the most prestigious academic event in known space, where the brightest minds presented groundbreaking research that could reshape entire civilizations. And here he was, a 17-year-old human from a backwater planet, about to present his project on Earth insects. The amphitheater itself was a marvel of engineering that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions at once. Seats arranged themselves automatically based on the physiology of each attendee, while translation matrices floated overhead, converting thoughts and speech between hundreds of languages. The stage at the center could project matter itself, creating perfect three-dimensional models of anything a presenter could imagine. Alex found his assigned preparation alcove and set up his ancient laptop next to a simple digital projector. The equipment looked laughably primitive compared to what the other students were using. A Lumenti student nearby was calibrating a device that created living holograms from pure light, while a Keth collective was synchronizing 17 different consciousness streams into a single presentation matrix. The first presenter was called to the stage, a brilliant young Vorthak named Krill, who had discovered a way to accelerate evolution in real time. As Krill spoke, entire ecosystems bloomed and evolved in the air above the audience, showing millions of years of development in mere minutes. The alien academics gasped and applauded as new species formed before their eyes. Next came a Drachmori, warrior scholar who had learned to weaponize stellar radiation, turning dying stars into strategic resources. The presentation included actual samples of captured starlight that danced around the amphitheater like living fire. Even the most jaded professors leaned forward in amazement. Alex watched presentation after presentation, each more incredible than the last. A young Ashanti had created artificial gravity wells small enough to hold in one's hand. A Keth collective had developed technology that could transfer memories between completely different species. The achievements were so far beyond anything Alex had ever imagined that he began to wonder if he should simply leave. His name was called sooner than expected. Professor Yilt, the Vorthak Symposium coordinator, announced in a tone that barely concealed disdain that the next presenter would be discussing primitive biological systems from the planet Earth. Several delegates in the audience made sounds that Alex's translator interpreted as snickering. Walking onto the stage felt like entering another world. The amphitheater stretched out around him in impossible directions, filled with beings whose civilizations had mastered technologies that humans could barely comprehend. Some had evolved beyond physical form entirely, existing as patterns of energy that communicated through controlled radiation. Others were ancient beyond measure, having witnessed the birth and death of multiple galaxies. Alex connected his laptop to the presentation system and watched as his simple PowerPoint slides appeared on screens around the amphitheater. The contrast was jarring. Where other presenters had created immersive experiences that engaged all senses, Alex's slides showed basic photographs and simple diagrams that looked like something from an elementary school science fair. A ripple of what his translator politely called amusement passed through the audience. Professor Yilt tapped his claws impatiently on the podium, clearly regretting the decision to include a human student in such a prestigious event. Several Keth drones began harmonizing in frequencies that translated roughly to "Why are we wasting time on this primitive nonsense?" The Ashanti delegation seemed particularly offended by the simplicity of Alex's presentation materials. Their entire civilization was built around the manipulation of pure energy and crystalline matrices that could process information at the speed of light. To them, Alex's laptop looked like a stone tool, and his slides appeared to be crude drawings. Compared to their ability to create matter from thought alone, even the more diplomatic species showed signs of restlessness. The Lumenti, who prided themselves on patience and courtesy, began dimming their natural luminescence in what Alex recognized as polite boredom. The massive Corvan delegates, whose bodies were living ecosystems containing billions of smaller organisms, started internal conversations that caused their skin to ripple with barely contained discussion. Alex took a deep breath and clicked to his first slide, which showed a simple photograph of an ant hill in his backyard on Earth. The image was so basic, so mundane compared to everything that had come before, that the silence in the amphitheater became almost oppressive. He could feel the weight of disappointment and judgment from thousands of beings who had expected to witness the next great breakthrough in galactic science, but as Alex began to speak, something in his voice carried a quiet confidence that seemed at odds with his simple presentation materials. He started with basic observations about how individual ants work together to build complex structures, how they communicated through chemical signals, and how they solved problems that would challenge even advanced computers. The audience remained skeptical, but something about the human's approach began to intrigue a few of the more thoughtful academics. While other presenters had focused on flashy technological achievements, Alex was discussing fundamental principles of organization and intelligence that transcended any particular technology. As he prepared to click to his second slide, Alex noticed that the restless murmuring in the audience had quieted slightly. Even the dismissive Professor Yilt seemed to be paying closer attention. Though his expression remained skeptical, Alex smiled to himself, knowing that his real presentation was just beginning. The second slide appeared on screens throughout the amphitheater, showing a close-up photograph of worker ants carrying pieces of leaves many times their own size. Alex began explaining how these insects could lift objects weighing 50 times their body weight and coordinate complex transportation networks without any central authority. The alien academics exchanged glances that clearly communicated their growing impatience with what they perceived as childish observations about insignificant creatures. Professor Yilt made no effort to hide his annoyance as he checked his chronometer. For the third time, the prestigious symposium was running behind schedule because of this primitive presentation about bugs. He had already received several mental complaints from the Keth Collective, whose shared consciousness was becoming increasingly agitated by what they considered a waste of their valuable time. A young Drakmori student in the front row actually stood up and began walking toward the exit, his multiple arms gesturing dismissively. His translator broadcasted his thoughts to anyone within range. These humans clearly had no understanding of real science if they thought observing insects qualified as meaningful research. Several other students followed his example, their footsteps echoing through the amphitheater as they abandoned Alex's presentation. The Ashanti delegation began glowing brighter, which Alex's cultural database informed him was a sign of irritation among their species. Elder Vex, the most respected Ashanti scientist in the galaxy, projected her thoughts directly into the translation matrix so everyone could hear her criticism. She questioned why the Academy had lowered its standards to include research that belonged in a kindergarten classroom rather than a galactic symposium. Alex clicked to his third slide, which showed different types of ant colonies working together to build bridges across water by linking their bodies together. He explained how millions of individual ants could create structures and solve problems without any single ant understanding the bigger picture. The presentation style remained simple and direct, with basic photographs and straightforward explanations that seemed almost insultingly elementary to the assembled academics. The Lumenti observer, whose species had evolved beyond the need for physical bodies and existed as pure consciousness, began broadcasting confusion across multiple dimensional frequencies. How had a species that studied insects ever developed space travel? The very concept seemed to contradict everything they understood about technological development and intellectual advancement. More students continued leaving as Alex moved through his slides about bee colonies and termite mounds. The massive Corvin delegate, whose body contained entire civilizations of smaller organisms, rumbled with what sounded like laughter. Through the translation system, his thoughts came across as deeply amused by the irony of a complex being like himself. Listening to a simple creature discuss even simpler creatures, Professor Yilt finally stood up and approached the podium, clearly intending to cut the presentation short and spare everyone further embarrassment. The Vorthic academic had built his reputation on discovering new forms of quantum biology that could manipulate matter at the subatomic level. To him, Alex's slideshow about ant behavior was not just boring but actively insulting to the intelligence of everyone present. But as Yilt reached the stage, Alex clicked to a slide showing mathematical formulas overlaying images of ant trails. For the first time, his presentation included something that looked remotely scientific to the alien academics. The equations dealt with optimization algorithms and network theory, subjects that even advanced civilizations found challenging. Alex began explaining how the seemingly random wandering of individual ants actually followed precise mathematical principles that could solve complex computational problems. He showed how ant colonies could find the shortest path between multiple points, optimize resource distribution, and adapt to changing conditions faster than most artificial intelligence systems. The exodus of students slowed as a few academics realized that the human might actually be discussing something more sophisticated than basic animal behavior. The Keth Collective, whose entire civilization was based on shared consciousness and distributed intelligence, began paying closer attention as Alex described how individual ants with no understanding of mathematics could collectively solve problems that required advanced calculus. However, the majority of the audience remained skeptical and dismissive. The Drakmori military observer, General Koth, transmitted his opinion that even if these insects showed some mathematical patterns, they were still just tiny creatures on a backward planet. Real warfare and strategy required intelligence, technology, and conscious planning, not the instinctive behavior of mindless bugs. The Shanti became even more agitated as Alex continued his presentation without displaying any of the advanced holographic technology or dimensional manipulation that they considered necessary for serious scientific work. Elder Vex projected her growing impatience, suggesting that the symposium organizers had made a serious error in judgment by including such primitive research among the galaxy's most important scientific presentations. Alex noticed the continuing departures and dismissive reactions but maintained his calm demeanor as he prepared for his fourth slide. He had expected this response and knew that everything he had presented so far was just foundation for what was coming next. The real revelation would require his audience to understand these basic principles first, even if they found them boring or obvious. As he reached for his laptop to advance the presentation, Alex caught sight of Professor Yilt's expression and realized that the Vorthic academic was about to intervene and end his presentation early. Several other faculty members were already standing, clearly planning to escort him off the stage. Before he could waste any more of their valuable time, the young human took a deep breath and clicked to slide 4, knowing that everything would change in the next few minutes. The image that appeared on screens throughout the amphitheater looked deceptively simple, a diagram showing how information flowed through an ant colony during an attack by predators. Alex began speaking with a confidence that seemed to come from nowhere, his voice carrying clearly through the vast space as he started explaining not just what the ants did, but why their behavior represented one of the most sophisticated strategic systems ever discovered. Slide 4 changed everything. Alex pointed to the diagram showing ant colony defense patterns and began explaining how these tiny insects had solved problems that stumped even the most advanced galactic civilizations. When predators attacked an ant colony, the response wasn't chaos or simple instinct. Instead, millions of individual ants implemented a distributed intelligence system that could process information, make strategic decisions, and coordinate complex responses faster than any known supercomputer. The students who had been walking toward the exits stopped in their tracks as Alex described how ant colonies used what humans called swarm intelligence to outthink enemies hundreds of times their size. He showed mathematical models demonstrating how information flowed through the colony like signals through a vast neural network, with each ant serving as both a processor and a communication node in a system that had no central command structure. Professor Yilt lowered his clawed hand and stepped back from the podium as Alex continued his explanation. The human was no longer discussing simple animal behavior, but describing principles of distributed computing and network theory that formed the foundation of several galactic technologies. The Vorthek academic realized with growing amazement that these Earth insects had evolved solutions to problems his own species still struggled with. Alex clicked through additional slides showing how human scientists had reverse-engineered ant algorithms to solve real-world problems. Logistics companies used ant-inspired routing systems to optimize delivery networks across multiple star systems. Military strategists employed ant warfare principles to coordinate attacks involving millions of autonomous units. Urban planners designed cities based on termite mound architecture that could regulate temperature, humidity, and resource flow without any central control system. The Keth Collective, whose entire civilization was built around shared consciousness, began broadcasting urgent harmonies as they realized the implications of what Alex was describing. These humans had spent centuries studying collective intelligence from the outside, developing insights that even hive minds themselves had never achieved. The collective had always assumed that distributed intelligence was natural and instinctive, but Alex was demonstrating that it could be analyzed, understood, and improved through mathematical principles. Elder Vex of the Ashanti stopped glowing with irritation and began pulsing with intense curiosity as Alex explained how human computer networks used bee colony optimization algorithms. Her species had mastered energy manipulation but had never understood why their own collective decision-making processes sometimes failed. The human was showing them systematic approaches to collective intelligence that could revolutionize Ashanti society. Alex advanced to slides showing how humans had weaponized their understanding of swarm behavior. Earth's military had developed tactics specifically designed to counter hive-minded species by introducing chaos into their collective decision-making processes. Small groups of humans could disrupt entire swarm networks by creating conflicting information patterns that caused collective intelligence systems to collapse into paralysis. The Drakmori General Koth leaned forward in his seat as Alex described human psychological warfare techniques designed to target collective consciousness. Earth strategists had identified the fundamental vulnerabilities in hive minds, their dependence on information consensus, their inability to process contradictory data, and their weakness to individualistic thinking patterns that could spread. Like viruses through shared consciousness networks, the amphitheater fell completely silent as Alex revealed that humanity had been preparing for contact with hive-minded species for over 2 centuries. While other civilizations focused on developing stronger weapons or more advanced technology, humans had pursued a different path. They had studied the mathematics of collective behavior, identified the weak points in distributed intelligence systems, and developed strategies that could defeat entire civilizations without firing a single shot. Professor Yilt found himself taking notes for the first time in decades as Alex explained how human anti-swarm tactics worked. By introducing specific patterns of misinformation into a hive mind's communication network, small human teams could cause collective intelligence systems to turn against themselves. The technique was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its effectiveness. The Lumenti observer, existing as pure consciousness, began broadcasting alarm frequencies as Alex described how humans could identify and exploit the computational limits of collective intelligence. Every hive mind had processing bottlenecks where too much information could cause system overload. Humans had mapped these vulnerabilities and developed weapons that attacked not physical bodies but the very foundations of collective thought. Alex's presentation took on an almost ominous tone as he described humanity's strategic doctrine for dealing with aggressive hive species. Earth's planners had anticipated that collective intelligent civilizations might view humanity as a threat to be absorbed or destroyed. In response, they had developed preemptive strategies designed to neutralize entire hive networks before they could coordinate attacks. Against human space, the audience realized with growing horror that what they had dismissed as primitive insect research was actually an advanced study of collective intelligence warfare. Alex wasn't just some student presenting a biology project. He was demonstrating that humanity possessed strategic knowledge that could threaten every hive-minded civilization. In known space, the Keth Collective began broadcasting panic harmonies as they understood the full implications. Their entire species was vulnerable to the techniques Alex was describing. Worse, the humans had developed these capabilities while appearing technologically backward and militarily weak. They had hidden their true strategic sophistication behind a facade of simple curiosity about bugs. Alex clicked to his final slide, which showed a simple photograph of Earth taken from space. He explained that humanity's greatest strength wasn't their technology or their individual intelligence, but their unique perspective as beings who could think both individually and collectively. They understood hive minds better than hive minds understood themselves because they could step outside collective thinking and analyze it objectively. The presentation ended with Alex stating calmly that humanity hoped to share their knowledge with peaceful species while defending themselves against any civilization that might mistake their apparent simplicity for actual weakness. The young human closed his laptop and waited for questions, unaware that his academic presentation had just redefined the balance of power in galactic civilization. In the darkness between galaxies, something vast and ancient stirred. The Hive Queen of the Swarm had been monitoring galactic communications for centuries, watching the rise and fall of countless civilizations with the patient interest of a predator studying potential prey. Her consciousness spanned billions of drones across thousands of star systems, a collective intelligence so massive that entire species had been absorbed into her ever-growing network without her individual attention. The Queen had been half aware of the transmission from the Galactic Academy Symposium, initially dismissing it as another tedious academic gathering from species too weak to resist absorption. Her attention was focused on more important matters: the systematic consumption of the Outer Rim territories and the integration of 17 newly conquered civilizations into her collective consciousness. But something in the human child's presentation began to penetrate her vast awareness like a sharp blade cutting through fabric. As Alex described ant colony defense mechanisms, the Queen felt an unfamiliar sensation that took her several moments to identify: unease. The mathematics he was presenting weren't just abstract theories but precise descriptions of vulnerabilities. In collective intelligence systems, the Queen's billions of drones suddenly stopped their various activities across 100 star systems as she focused her entire consciousness on the transmission from the Academy. Alex was explaining how individual units in a collective could be turned against the whole through carefully introduced information patterns. The Queen realized with growing alarm that he was describing techniques that could work against her own network. As Alex clicked through slides showing human anti-swarm tactics, the Queen began running urgent simulations across her vast intelligence. She tested the scenarios he described against her own collective structure and discovered to her horror that every technique would be devastatingly effective. The humans had identified weaknesses in hive mind architecture that she had never even considered possible. The revelation that humans had been studying collective intelligence for centuries sent waves of panic through the Queen's network. Her drones began broadcasting confusion signals as they felt their leader's distress rippling through the shared consciousness. She had always assumed that hive minds were inherently superior to individual intelligences, but Alex was proving that outside observation could reveal fatal flaws invisible from within the collective. When Alex described how humans could introduce chaos into hive communication networks, the Queen experienced something she had never felt before: fear. She began frantically analyzing her own information processing systems and discovered that they were indeed vulnerable to the exact attacks the human was describing. A small group of humans using the right techniques could potentially collapse her entire civilization. The Queen's terror intensified as Alex explained how collective intelligence systems could be overloaded with contradictory information. She realized that her network's greatest strength, its ability to process and share information instantly across billions of nodes, was also its greatest weakness. The humans had found a way to turn collective intelligence against itself. As Alex moved to slides showing actual human military doctrine for fighting Hive species, the Queen began to understand the true scope of the threat. These weren't theoretical concepts, but operational strategies that Earth's forces had been developing and refining for generations. Humanity had been preparing for war against species like hers. While appearing completely harmless to galactic civilization, the Queen's panic reached critical levels when Alex described psychological warfare techniques designed to fragment collective consciousness. The human was calmly explaining how to introduce individualistic thought patterns into hive minds, like viruses that could spread and multiply until entire networks collapsed into chaos. She realized that her species' absorption of other civilizations had actually made them more vulnerable by creating multiple points of entry for such attacks. In desperation, the Queen began withdrawing her forces from active conquest zones and recalling exploration fleets to defensive positions. But even as she reorganized her military assets, she understood that traditional defenses would be useless against the techniques Alex was describing. The humans weren't threatening to attack her physical forces, but to destroy the very foundations of her collective existence. The final horror came when Alex explained that humanity's anti-hive strategies were designed to work preemptively. The Queen realized that if humans detected her presence in their region of space, they wouldn't wait for her to make the first move. They would strike at her collective consciousness itself, using techniques that could cripple her entire civilization. Before she could respond, as Alex's presentation concluded, the Queen made a decision that would have been unthinkable just hours earlier. She began composing surrender messages in every language known to galactic civilization, desperately trying to establish communication with Earth before humanity could deploy their anti-swarm capabilities against her, the Hive Queen, whose collective consciousness had consumed entire galaxies and absorbed countless civilizations, found herself begging for mercy from a species she had dismissed as primitive. The irony was not lost on her vast intelligence. She had been defeated not by superior technology or military might, but by the simple wisdom of a human child who understood her better than she understood herself. Across her network, billions of drones felt their Queen's terror and began broadcasting the same desperate message toward the small blue planet that had just become the most feared world in known space. The swarm, humanity's greatest potential enemy, was surrendering before the war had even begun. The amphitheater remained in absolute silence for what felt like an eternity after Alex finished his presentation. The young human stood calmly at the podium, his simple laptop closed, seemingly unaware that he had just redefined the balance of power in galactic civilization. The alien academics stared at him with expressions ranging from awe to terror, their previous dismissiveness replaced by a profound understanding of how catastrophically they had misjudged humanity. Professor Yelt was the first to recover from the shock. The Vorthak academic, who had been ready to cut short Alex's presentation out of embarrassment, now approached the podium with trembling claws. His species had survived for millennia by accurately assessing threats and opportunities, and every instinct was screaming that the human child represented both in unprecedented measure. The professor's voice shook as he formally apologized to Alex for his earlier dismissiveness and requested immediate emergency sessions with Earth's academic institutions. The Vorthak hegemony needed to understand human strategic thinking before any other civilization realized the full implications of what had just been revealed. Yelt's political mind was already calculating how this knowledge could be used to protect his species while advancing their position in galactic affairs. The Keth Collective's reaction was far more dramatic. Their shared consciousness, which had seemed so unified and powerful just hours earlier, now felt fragile and vulnerable. The drones began broadcasting frantic harmony patterns as they realized that their entire civilization was built on principles that humans could exploit and destroy. Elder Prime, speaking for the collective, transmitted an urgent request for defensive alliance negotiations with Earth. The collective's terror was palpable as they understood that their greatest advantage, the ability to think and act as one, had been revealed as their greatest weakness. They began implementing emergency protocols to compartmentalize their consciousness, trying to create firewalls that might protect them from the psychological warfare techniques Alex had described. Elder, Vex of the Ashanti, rose from her crystalline seat, her entire body pulsing with colors that translated as profound respect mixed with deep concern. Her species had mastered energy manipulation and dimensional travel, but they had never encountered beings who could weaponize understanding itself. She projected a formal invitation for Alex to visit the Ashanti homeworld as their most honored guest, while simultaneously authorizing her government to begin immediate treaty negotiations with humanity. The Ashanti delegation was frantically transmitting reports back to their home system, warning their leaders that humanity represented a new form of power that transcended traditional military or technological capabilities. The humans had achieved strategic superiority through pure intellectual insight, making them potentially more dangerous than any weapon-wielding civilization. General Koth of the Drakomori stood and offered what his species considered the highest form of respect, a warrior's salute typically reserved for enemies who had proven themselves in glorious battle. The military leader's tactical mind appreciated the elegance of humanity's approach to warfare, even as he began calculating how his own forces might defend. Against such strategies, the Drakomori had built their civilization on the principles of strength through conflict, but Alex had demonstrated that true strength might come from understanding rather than force. Koth began composing reports to his war council recommending immediate military cooperation agreements with Earth, recognizing that humanity could be either their greatest ally or their most terrifying enemy. The Lumenti observer, existing as pure consciousness, began broadcasting complex mathematical frequencies that translated as both admiration and existential dread. Their species had evolved beyond physical form by mastering collective thought, but now they realized that this evolution might have made them vulnerable to exactly the kind of attacks Alex had described. As news of the presentation spread beyond the amphitheater, alien governments across the galaxy began receiving reports that would fundamentally change their foreign policies. The human species, previously dismissed as a minor player in galactic affairs, was suddenly being reassessed as a potential superpower whose capabilities had been completely misunderstood. Alex watched the chaos unfold around him with the calm demeanor of someone who had expected exactly this reaction. He answered questions from the alien academics with the same straightforward approach he had used in his presentation, explaining complex strategic concepts in simple terms that made their implications even more terrifying. The young human's communication device began receiving messages from across the galaxy as word spread about his presentation. Diplomatic requests, academic invitations, and what appeared to be surrender offers were flooding in from dozens of species. The most urgent message came from an unknown source identifying itself as the Hive Queen of the Swarm, desperately requesting peaceful contact with humanity. Alex read the Hive Queen's message aloud to the assembled academics, causing another wave of stunned silence. The Swarm was legendary throughout the galaxy as an unstoppable force that had consumed entire civilizations. Yet here was their queen, begging for mercy from a human teenager who had given a school presentation about insects. Professor Yilt declared that the symposium would be extended indefinitely to allow for full analysis of Alex's presentation and its implications. The Galactic Academy immediately restructured its entire curriculum to include mandatory courses on human strategic thinking, recognizing that understanding humanity's perspective had become essential for survival in the new galactic order. As the session finally ended, Alex packed his simple laptop and prepared to leave the amphitheater. He had accomplished everything he had hoped for and more. Humanity was no longer seen as a primitive backwater species but as a civilization whose unique insights made them indispensable allies and terrifying enemies. The young human smiled as he walked past alien academics who now viewed him with the kind of respect usually reserved for galactic emperors. His presentation about insects had accidentally revealed that the real power in the universe belonged not to those with the best technology or the strongest weapons, but to those who understood the fundamental principles underlying all intelligence itself.